Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is session 2 out of 5 here at Web Yeshiva of the mini course called Food for Thought, the Torah of Eating. And just to repeat what we said from last time, in general, we will be doing one hashkafa topic and one halacha topic, followed by the parsha recipes and dessert ideas at the end. This week is on the same topic, namely vegetarianism. So I figured that we can I can make the source sheet for the hashkafa longer than usual because really they're both about the same topic anyway. Just a little introduction. Um, when uh, when I was 20, I stopped eating meat. So that's most of my most of my life has been in the status of being a vegetarian. I read a book that convinced me. It was called Diet for a New America by John Robbins. And he argued that on grounds of health and cruelty to animals and also an environmental issue, which I didn't quite understand, um, it's better for people not to eat meat, meat or chicken. So I decided I'm going to do that. I'm going to stop eating meat. At first, I said to people, I'm not a vegetarian because in religious circles that often has connotations of different ideologies, and people are very defensive about it. So I said, I'm not a vegetarian. I'm just not eating meat. And for some reason that that didn't go over well. People had no idea what I was talking about. It was too subtle. So I started saying, fine, I'm a vegetarian. But I am what some people call a level 2 vegetarian, meaning I do eat fish, but I don't eat meat or chicken. I once had a conversation with another Orthodox rabbi vegetarian, Rabbi David Levenkrus, who for many years was one of the administrators at Pardes in Pardes Institute in Yerushalayim. And but I met him earlier when he was at Yeshiva HaMivtar. We were both there, and he said that uh, he knew a whole bunch of vegetarians, both Jewish and non-Jewish, but he said it was only among the Jews that he found this uh, in between position, saying, I am not going to eat meat or chicken, but I am going to eat fish. And he suggested, his theory was that um, it's because regardless of whether you are completely observant of kashrut or not, if you're Jewish and somewhat knowledgeable, you probably are aware that fish does not count as meat in for halachic purposes. So therefore, it's possible to make a distinction between fish and meat. Whereas he continued, if you're not Jewish, so the animals are animals. What does it matter if some of them walk and some of them fly and some of them swim? Either you eat animals or you don't. I thought that was an interesting theory. I have not done any scientific studies. Even to this day, I do find people who say, "But are you even allowed to be a vegetarian if you're following halacha? What about Yom Tov? What about Shabbat?" And that's going to be our halacha topic for this session after the hashkafa one. We'll do that near the end of the session. Uh, People sometimes also say, what about the Karban Pesach? After all, when there's a Beit HaMikdash, then there's an obligation to eat of the Karban Pesach on the night of the Seder. So when people ask me that, I say the same answer that I've heard from other people as well, which is I will be willing to eat a kazayit, the size of an olive, of meat once a year in order to fulfill a Torah obligation. Sure, but that has nothing to do with eating habits the rest of the year, and certainly now that there isn't a Beit HaMikdash. Meaning, even when there is a Karan Pesach, even when there is a Beit HaMikdash, an individual does not have to eat of a given korban as long as somebody eats it. And the Karban Pesach is an obligation, a collective obligation, but each individual has to eat a kazayit. Okay. Anyway, just to conclude the uh, uh, this introduction, I was lucky to marry someone who, while she does eat meat and serves meat, she is a vegetarian sympathizer. So I didn't have to spend a lot of time arguing about it. Although we concluded pretty quickly that we are not going to have just one set of dishes. I thought it would make life easier for kashrut, but no, we do have two sets. I see that Mark asked, "Do I look forward to slaughtering animals in the Beit HaMikdash?" Well, I'm not going to do it. Um, and no individual Kohen needs to do it. It would be interesting if everybody wanted to be a vegetarian, but I don't see that as changing anytime soon. On the question of is it appropriate to kill animals for korbanot, I have a whole shiur about that. The short answer is, in the words of, let's see if I can find the quote uh, offhand. Uh, just a minute. Here it is. From Rabbi Brad Artson of Los Angeles. It is a paradox of contemporary living that people who eat dead cow for lunch while wearing the flesh of animals on their feet and to keep their pants up consider it barbaric to kill an animal for a religious purpose. Meaning, as long as people are eating meat, then they should not have a problem with korbanot. But that actually is a separate topic. Let's get right into the hashkafa issue. Um, I'm This is not going to be an overview of all the sources because that would take way too long. I don't know if I could do a whole semester, but certainly you would need more than one session for this. We're just going to present an approach that appears, or a couple of variations on approach that appears um, in two or three classic sources about the idea of to what extent vegetarianism is an ideal from a Torah perspective. So I have a separate shiur on Parshat Noach and vegetarianism, and I have yet another separate shiur about eating meat and Parsha Re'eh. So we're just going to do a few of the sources in this session. So in fact, jumping right into Torah Shabbat, and then we'll go back to look at it. Gemara, starting from source number 3, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Tet, says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Adam Harishon, as in Adam, the first person, the first man, depending on when you hear it for this purpose, Adam and Chava are the same. Lo tarlo basar la'achila. They were not allowed to eat meat, as it says in the pasuk that appears right over here in source number 1. In fact, let's look at that pasuk now, and then we'll go back to the Gemara. After God says, "Be fruitful, and multiply, conquer the earth, and you will rule over the fish and the birds and the animals." God says to Adam and Chava, "I have given you all the plants, asher al pnei kol haaretz, but kol ha'etz asher bo pri ha'etz, any tree that has that gives fruit, zarei zara, that has seeds, lachem yeh la'achla, you are allowed to eat all of the vegetable matter. You can eat from all the plants. And I've given it to you, and God says, I have also given it, the vegetable kingdom, to the animals." Okay, so the Gemara derives from this that if God specifies you're allowed to eat the plants, that implies that you're not allowed to eat the animals. The Gemara goes on to say, it's it is for you to eat the plants, and it's for the animals to eat the plants, but the animals are not for you. And when the children of Noach came, meaning, as we're about to see, what God said to Noach and his children when they came out of the ark after the flood, Hitir lahem, God permitted them to eat animals. Shnei as it says, we're about to see the pasuk. Kiyark esev natati lachem et kol. I have given you everything like the plants. Let's look at that right here. This is in source number 2, Breishi Parak Tet. God said to Noach and his children, Pru'ervu, be fruitful and multiply, meaning God starts by giving them the same directive, what looks like the same directive that he gave to Adam and Chava. It's a little bit different here with but these animals will fear you, which is not the same thing as what it said earlier. You will rule over them. Um, I've given them to you. Kol remas asher huchai, anything that crawls, that is alive and moving things. Lachem yalachla, you're allowed to eat them. Ki yerek esav natati lachem et kol. I have given you everything. I've given you all of them, just like the plants. Meaning, just like I gave Adam and Chava, and the last 10 generations or so between them and you, I allowed them to eat the plants. So from now on, you are allowed to eat animals also. They're just as permitted for you to eat as the vegetables have been permitted for everyone to eat until now. And then God goes on to say, but you're not allowed to eat it while it's alive. And nefesh in biblical Hebrew usually means alive, with its blood, which we interpret to mean both that one of the 7 mitzvot that applies to all human beings is they're not allowed to eat aver min achai, they're not allowed to eat an animal while it's still alive, and also this is a precedent for what will be the mitzvah that God will give after the Torah is given to the Jews. You're not allowed to eat the blood. And your blood, people blood, I will hold you responsible for. Anybody who kills another human being will be held responsible for that. Shofech dam adam ba'adam damoi shafech. If a person spills the blood of a person, through a person, their blood should be spilled because God made people in God's image. Tzelem Elokim. So the Gemara derives from the apparent the parallels, compare and contrast that Adam and Chava and everybody until the Mabul, everybody was allowed to eat vegetables, fruits and vegetables, but not animals. And since Noach, people were allowed to eat animals. The question then is, and this is just 4 sources, but we're not going to spend too much time on this. The question is, what changed? Why should God have changed the rule? So we'll just look at a couple of sources that the Gemara, the Medrash in Breshit Rabbah says that the animals would be afraid of people after the flood, uridia lo chazra, but not the ruling over them. That there was some kind of status that Adam and Adam's descendants had with regard to animals. God appointed Adam and the people to be the rulers of the animals, and that did not come back after the flood. So skipping to Rav Yonatan Grossman, source number 6, he's he teaches Tanakh at Bar Ilan University as well as Machon Herzog and Elon Shavut, just doing little bits and pieces. He says on the top right, the responsibility of a king is to concern himself with the social order in his kingdom, justice, righteousness, take care of his subjects. So long as man's position involved ruling and governing the world, he clearly could not eat his subjects. However, when man failed in this task, thus leading to the flood, the harmony of the entire system was disrupted. And following this, God renewed the world, but this time people were not given the same reins of rulership. Man still has immense power, and can be described as the top of the food chain. But man nevertheless remains a creature preying on those weaker than himself. In other words, to some extent, it's the being allowed to eat meat, according to this Rav Grossman interpreting the Midrash, is because we could no longer continue with the failed position of ruling over the animals, in which case we weren't allowed to eat them. Since we're no longer ruling over the animals, then there is a possibility of being able to not be responsible for them per se, but being able to kill them as needed. The way the Ramban formulates it is a little bit different. He says in source number 5 that it's because Noach, following God's instruction, took representatives of all the animals in the ark in order to save them from the flood, Therefore, since they all owed their lives to Noach and his and since the animals now owe their lives to people, therefore God gave people permission to kill and eat the animals, ki kiyumam ba'avuro, because they wouldn't be in the world at all if not for Noach saving them. That's a very different type of answer from the one given by Rav Grossman. The It's interesting that even though, like as I started to say before, there's a lot more you could say about this. Just say just a little bit more before we move on to Sefer Devarim. That This is still Rav Grossman here, the top right of page 2. That God originally said to Noach in Adam, to source 1, let us make man in our image, and they will have dominion over the fish, the animals, etc. In that context, in Bereshit Perek Aleph, man appears only at the conclusion of the creation of the world, and all the other creations are already in place. Okay, so Noach, I'm sorry, Adam, he was not part of this world, not part of the animal kingdom, but in a position of responsibility for it. In contrast, after the flood, people are an integral part of these worldly creations with no special status, granting them rulership. So therefore, they don't appear at the conclusion as rulers, but rather all together with the other creatures. Now God reboots the world, and everybody appears at the same time. So people are mammals, and therefore as far as eating rules, they don't have any rules to set them apart from animals. This is all Rav Grossman's understanding of why Noach and his descendants were allowed to eat meat. A variation of this appears in Shir by Rabbi Dr. Tamir Granot. He's the head of Yeshivat Shaul in Tel Aviv. And he suggests that, look at the second paragraph, talking about Noach. From now on, people may make use of animals, but this is related to the selection of a smaller group. Which is paralleling what later happens during the course of Sefer Bereshit. Avraham and his descendants are selected to set them apart from everybody else. And then God made a covenant with Avram, and Avram had more responsibilities. So here, going back to Noach, this new kingdom in which that Noach and his descendants are separate from everybody else. This is in some sense not exactly the opposite, but a different approach from Rabbi Grossman. The overarching principle of the humans after the flood is the image of God, which is what God emphasized to explain why you're allowed to kill animals. You're not allowed to kill people. Why not? Because people are created in the image of God. Animals are not. As opposed to, what was the overarching principle before the flood? Life. People are alive. So among people who are alive, creatures who are alive, people were in charge of the other creatures who are alive. But now God made a distinction, separating the people from the rest in the sense for extra rules, extra responsibility, in the same way that God would later separate Avram and his descendants from the rest, make a smaller group and give them extra responsibility. So this is a very brief summary of some of the sources about why Adam was allowed to eat only the vegetables, fruits and vegetables, but only starting with Noach. There's a lot more material on this. But for our purposes, let's skip to after the Torah is given, because if somebody wants to object, how can you say that vegetarianism is an ideal? One of the mitzvot in the Torah is to kill an animal. I mean, there are a bunch of mitzvot in the Torah that have to do with killing an animal for God, but killing an animal for yourself to eat, this is one of the mitzvot. Let's take a look at that briefly. When I've given a shir in the context of Sefer Re'eh, of Sefer Devarim and Parsha Re'eh, there's a lot of material before and after in Parsha Re'eh that fits in with this. But we're just going to be focusing on a few psukim here. After it speaks about karbanot, you're not allowed to kill an animal for God. Just anywhere, you have to go to the central location, the Mishkan, and eventually the Beit HaMikdash. Rak, this is Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Tet Vav, here in source number 8. Rak b'chava nafshecha, but with all of the desire of your, remember I said before, nefesh in biblical Hebrew usually means life. Sometimes it doesn't mean life, it means appetite. Here, with all the desire of your appetite, tizbach ve'achalta vasar, you can slaughter and eat meat. Kivrkat Hashem Elokecha, in accordance with God's blessing that God gives you. Then it speaks about different types of animals. Rak, but hadam lo tochilu. When you do eat meat, you're not allowed to eat the blood. Arts tishbachenu kamayim. You should spill it on the ground like water, and then not getting into the details here. But there's a mitzvah of kiswei hadam, of covering the blood with earth. I hope we'll mention that a bit later in the session. And then a couple of psukim later, pasuk chaf, ki yarchiv Hashem Elokecha et gvucha. When God expands your boundaries, you are settled in the land of Israel. Amarta ochla basar, and you say, I am going to eat meat. I want to eat meat. Because your appetite desires to eat meat. Well then, with all the desire of your appetite, you can eat meat. It sounds a bit redundant. If we haven't figured it out yet, the word ta'ava or ava has been mentioned 3 times so far. Avat nafshecha, that expression. Why would you eat meat? Because you desire it. You're allowed to. And then when you're far away from the Beit Hamikdash, you can still slaughter an animal. Kasher tziviticha. We're just glossing over that, but this is the source for a lot of discussion about the rules of shechita being in Torah Shebaal Peh. They must be in the oral Torah, because the written Torah doesn't say how we're supposed to kill an animal. It just says, as I commanded you. As God commanded us where? Not in the written Torah, it must be in the oral Torah. Then when you do that, you slaughter it, you kill the animal the way that I told you, and then you could eat it in your territory, literally in your gates, with all the desire of your appetite. 4th time, okay? But skipping a bit, chazak, you need to be strong. Don't eat the blood. Ki adam hu hanafesh. The blood is the life. They sometimes translated the blood is the soul. I think the pshat is usually understood to be the life. There's a variation of what Hashem told Noach, but this is much stricter, because you can't eat just any animals. It's being mentioned here, but elaborate on in greater detail elsewhere in Parsha Re'eh, which animals are the kosher and the non-kosher ones. How do you kill the animal? As I commanded you, which we have a tradition about shechita and bedika and malicha and all sorts of rules about that. And you're not allowed to eat the blood. We usually assume that part of doing shechita properly is making sure that the blood comes out, and the salt gets the blood out. And then it repeats that a few more times. Don't eat it. Don't eat that blood. So if I stopped here, so is it a mitzvah in the Torah to eat meat or not? Yes and no. It's in the category of mitzvah in the Torah that start with ki. The word ki, which means in context when. When this situation happens, then here's what you need to do about it. A lot of those here's what you need to do statements in the Torah are on the list of the 613 mitzvot. However, we mentioned this in myth-busting session number 6. One of the myths that I presented was that all the mitzvot in the Torah are supposed to be lechatchila. They're supposed to be done in an ideal way. Or the fact that the Torah tells you to do mitzvot, any given mitzvah, that means the Torah wants you to do that. There are a bunch of sources. We only looked at a couple at the time, Rabbi Benjamin Blech, Rav Moshe Amiel. But there's plenty of precedent for saying that at least a couple, if not a whole bunch, of the mitzvot in the Torah are designed to be only if you're in that situation. It's not ideal, but if you're in the situation, here's what you need to do. The classic example of this, of course, is in the Gemara. The Gemara says it about Yifat Toar, the beautiful woman who is taken captive by the Jewish soldier. The woman is from the enemy. He should not just chas v'shalom rape her on the battlefield, but rather, if he wants to marry her, then he wants, then he needs to wait a month, etc., etc. The Gemara says about that, Dibur Torah keneged Yetzirah. The Torah is responding to the desire, literally the evil inclination. In other words, the simple way to understand that Gemara is, there's a lot to say about that Gemara. I have a separate share on that. But ideally, the Jewish soldier wouldn't want to marry the Syrian woman or uh, uh, Saudi Arabian or whatever, Hamas, whatever enemy of the Jews, and convert her to Judaism. How is that going to work? How is she going to blend in? The whole thing is a bad idea, but the Torah says if you're going to do it, here's the way to do that. The question is, what other mitzvot are in this category? Um, Rabbi Amiel mentions a bunch of others. He mentions the mitzvah of a king, which is a debate in the Gemara, and he mentions this as well, the mitzvah of shchita, meaning if you're going to eat meat, if you need to eat meat, it says 4 times, if you desire to eat meat, well then the mitzvah is to kill the animal in this particular way. But there's room to say, and Rav Amiel doesn't really spell this out, there's room to say that since this mitzvah starts, if when you're in the situation, then here's the way you're supposed to deal with it, then there's room to say maybe it would be better to not have the situation in the first place. And the one who says this explicitly in the classic sources, one of the early Achronim, is Rav Yosef Albo. Rav Yosef Albo in the Sefer Ikarim, of the classic Jewish philosophers, he's the only one of the only ones who wrote in Hebrew and not in Arabic. I'm going to skip till the next page because what he says first is a different issue, and if we have time, we'll come back to this. But he says, look at the end of source number 9. This is on the top left of page 3. With the Torah, after the Torah was given, God permitted the Jews to eat meat, but lo dibra Torah ela keneged Yetzirah. When God said, if you can do the mitzvah of shchita if you want to eat meat, that's only in the exact same way that God said permitted the whole situation of Yifat Toar. God permitted eating meat, but really it would be better to not eat meat. And he quotes a Gemara in partial support of this, Gemara in Chulin, that says that the Torah doesn't tell you an obligation. The Torah teaches you derech eretz, meaning proper manners, possibly proper morality, but in context, proper manners is probably more accurate, that it's better for a person not to eat meat at all, except when they really feel the need for it, which back at the time of the Gemara was probably not that often. Hinei gilu b'feirush. They, the rabbis, the sages, they revealed explicitly here, she'achilat habasar, eating meat, lo hutar ella, it was only permitted al tzad ha'echrech, only when it was, to the extent that it's necessary. And that's why it was forbidden at the very beginning of creation, because it wasn't necessary at the beginning. This is Rav Albo. I don't think he was a vegetarian, or at least I've never heard of him being a vegetarian. There is a much later rabbi died a little less than 100 years ago, Rav Kook, who is incorrectly attributed the status of being vegetarian. Why do people think that Rav Kook was a vegetarian? Because he wrote 2 long essays that were then abbreviated into this book I'm holding up right here, a very, very thin book called Chazon HaTzimchonut VaHaShalom, A Vision of Vegetarianism and Peace, that were put together by his student, Rav David Cohen, not related to me. You can find it in English online. Rav Kook talks about, and we'll see bits of it shortly, how eating meat is not ideal. And in the future, we will go back to the to the Edenic state of being in the Garden of Eden and not eating meat. Eating meat is a very b'diavad thing. It's not ideal. Because Rav Kook is famous for saying that, people incorrectly assume that therefore he was a vegetarian. He was famously, or at least for the people who knew him personally, he was not a vegetarian because, as we'll see shortly, he also thought that it's not a good idea today to be a vegetarian. So saying vegetarianism is an ideal, that's the title of this session, is not the same thing as saying you should actually do it. Let's look at just a couple of parts of Rav Kook. Rav Kook is difficult to understand in general because he wrote in very poetic Hebrew, and also is a pre-modern Hebrew. But even in translation, it's not so easy. So I decided that the parts that we're going to look at of Rav Kook, we're just going to look at in two things from this booklet. One of them is he speaks about the phrase that we just looked at in source number 9, that when you say, I want to eat meat, I have the urge to eat meat, then fine. Rav Kook says there is a hidden rebuke here. In other words, Rav Kook compares eating meat to cannibalism. And Rav Kook says, you already abhor the eating of human flesh, meaning people in general, with rare exceptions in cultures here and there in human history. And even then, it tended to be very limited in specific situations. In general, most human societies consider cannibalism to be a terrible thing, a abhorrent thing. So Rav Kook says the Torah, that's why the Torah doesn't ban cannibalism. There's a whole shiur on this. I've heard shiurim on this topic, but this is one of the approaches. The Torah didn't need to make a prohibition against eating people because one does not need an external warning when one has already acquired a certain concept. Naturally, you already have it in you. In contrast, most people do not abhor the eating of animal flesh. There doesn't seem to be that kind of taboo in most societies. So that's why Rav Kook says, that's why he keeps referring to the desire. Because you desire it, because you haven't reached, you collectively, people, Jews, you have not reached the level of viewing viewing the eating of animals in the same way that you view the eating of people. So fine. So as long as that's the case, you're allowed to eat animals. But when the time comes in the future for the human moral condition to abhor eating the flesh of animals, you surely will not have the urge to eat meat, and then you will not eat it. That's Rav Kook's interpretation of why the Torah says 4 times when you desire, when you feel the urge to eat meat. That he thinks that the Torah itself is implying that in the same breath as saying you're allowed to eat meat, it's presenting it as because this is the level that people are on. The people are not on such an ideal level. Just one more brief thing before we move on. Rav Kook speaks about how we should view eating meat as something embarrassing. Where do you see that? He says because the Torah tells us to cover the blood. Rav Kook interprets this to mean it is hiding your shame and your moral weakness that we collectively, humans, we have not reached the level where we couldn't bring ourselves to eat animals because we're not on that level. Okay, so we're allowed to eat animals, but on some level we're a little bit embarrassed about that. A variation of this appears in a Dvar Torah from 1990 in the Long Island Jewish World by Rabbi J. Leonard Rahm, source number 12. He is the father of a classmate of mine at Yeshiva University. Rabbi Rahm is now retired, but he was a rabbi of conservative synagogues in the New York area for many years, Parkchester, the Bronx, Baldwin, Great Neck. He and his wife made Aliyah, and they live in Haifa. So he suggests that kashrut, overall, the regulations serve in a sense to delustify the eating of meat, meaning if you translate avat nafshecha is when you lust after meat. So kashrut points us, kashrut does not ban eating meat, but it points us in the direction of moving away from that desire. So here's the scenario. You have a desire to eat meat. First of all, you are limited in your options as to which animals you may eat. Okay, you've selected what's kosher, what's not kosher. You've selected proper animal. You can't just kill it any way you please. You can't eat it if it's already dead. It's complicated procedures for slaughter. That ought to put the brakes on your desire. And then there's checking the knife and reciting the blessings. After this is was more relevant back when people ate their own animals, which they had slaughtered or had slaughtered in front of them. After the act of slaughter, there's a ceremonial burial of the blood, an inspection of organs. Okay, you can't eat all parts and fats of the animal. You see what he's doing? He's going through a lot of the rules of kashrut to point in one direction. You selected proper cut of the meat. Okay, was it soaked and salted to remove enough surface blood to make it less like real red bloody meat than the carnivore in you really craves? Okay, and now how are you going to prepare it and cook it and serve it? You have to keep it away from milk, etc., etc. You sure you still want that? So yes, we who keep kosher may still eat meat if it has undergone all the complicated steps to make it kosher, but there's at least a subconscious embarrassment about eating meat from everything that he said until now, meaning that all the rules of kashrut, at least as originally applied in pre-modern times, without banning meat, they made a slow down and restricted us in a lot of ways in the meat eating process. And then he adds something else, which is less obvious, but it's interesting theory. All utensils come in contact with meat are kept separate and distinct from all other utensils we use for food. It's as though our milchig, our dairy utensils, those are our real utensils, and our fleshig, the meaty ones, are segregated embarrassment for when we give in to our lust for meat. I don't know if I buy that, but it's clever. If we stopped here, I'd say, well, then there's reason to say that it's better not to eat meat because it's not ideal. Vegetarianism is ideal. However, both Rav Albo and Rav Kook give reasons why we should be wary about this. Meaning you can't just quote Rav Albo or Rav Kook to say, oh, that's why everybody should be vegetarians. The part that I skipped from Rav Albo, since we're running out of time, how did that happen? Summarized here in source number 13, I'll just mention briefly, Rabbi David Nagar Powers is a YU Musmach who's working as a computer programmer in the New York area. His last name used to be Nagar, or Eriko Nagar. Then he married a former student of mine named Leah Powers, and they combined their last names. So now they're both Nagar Powers. He wrote this article for a Yeshiva University publication back when he was in college. And it's pretty impressive, both because it's well researched and in the part we're going to see shortly of Rabbi Soloveitchik, nobody else seems to have noticed this. People like to quote Rav Albo and Rav Kook on the subject. Rav Soloveitchik has basically gone under the radar. But just to summarize what Rav Albo is concerned about, he warns his readers against thinking that people and animals are equals. And he interprets, this is in Hebrew that we skipped earlier in source number 9, he interprets the sin and the whole context of Cain and Hevel to be based on the mistake, Cain's mistake in thinking that either you're not allowed to kill animals or people, or you are allowed to kill animals and people, but animals and people should be considered the same. So Rav Albo suggested that was part of the problem. It led to the Cain killing Hevel. It ended up leading to the flood, and that's why God emphasized that point. Going back to the question of why did God allow Noah to eat animals? Because this was God was saying that totally different answer from what we saw until now. Enough is enough. Okay, I'm making a distinction here between people and animals. It's not plants versus people and animals. It's plants and animals, which you're allowed to eat, and people you're not allowed to eat or kill for that matter. So Rav Albo is concerned about people missing the distinction between people and animals. And Rav Kook, even though he goes on and on about great reasons to be a vegetarian, he also gives reasons why not to be a vegetarian, as summarized here in Rabbi Nagar Powers. That first of all, Rav Kook says that there are major problems in the world. I know he was writing in the early 1900s, and we don't have problems anymore. But let's imagine there are major problems in the world. We haven't fixed the problems of war. We haven't fixed the problems of injustice. So those are should be much bigger priorities than the issue of eating meat. He's also concerned about, like Rav Albo, about the problems of people saying, "Oh, I could never kill an animal." because animals are special. People, not so much. He's worried about, if people are no different from animals, so then, you know, this one kills an animal and this one kills a person, or this one eats a person. What's the difference anyway? Rav Kook is concerned about that issue that Rav Albo brought up, and and a variation of this is that he's afraid that, well, if animals and people are equal, then there's no difference between killing a person and swatting a fly. The difference between reasons 2 and 3 are one's about cannibalism, one's about murder. And that's why Rav Kook thinks that vegetarianism, it is an ideal, but it's not an ideal in life as we know it, which is why supposedly he didn't eat meat on Shabbat, or maybe it was on Yom Tov, but like during the week, Rav Kook ate meat and he thought it was a good idea. So if somebody's going to quote Rav Kook about why vegetarianism is an ideal, well, then if you want to convince people to be vegetarian, you're going to need another source. To be a vegetarian today, you're going to need another source than that of Rav Kook. It turns out there is another source of like major rabbis, as Rabbi Nagar Powers points out. Rav Soloveitchik wrote a whole essay called "Man as a Carnivorous Being." Since we are running out of time, I'm just going to look at a couple of bits of this, but this is part of his article. The reason why people have not noticed it is because even though Rabbi Soloveitchik died in 1993, these views were not published until 2005. One of the many books published by Rabbi Soloveitchik since he died. So Rabbi Nagar Powers summarizes this this long essay of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and basically the summary is that he is goes back to the word ta'ava, the lust, as the Torah says 4 times in a row, and Rabbi Soloveitchik suggests that it's a very negative formulation, that that really it would be better not to desire to eat animals, and he ties that into Parsha Ba'alotcha, Kivrota Ta'ava, the lust for animal flesh. According to Rabbi Soloveitchik, vegetarianism should be practiced, but okay, people, it's too hard for people, but really it would be better for people to not eat animals. Just to sum up over here, based on Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he doesn't, the chidush, the new idea of Rabbi Soloveitchik compared to that of Rav Albo and Rav Kook is that he doesn't then say, however, I'm really concerned about people not being able to distinguish between humans and animals. He doesn't bring that up, meaning he doesn't give the caveat of the like, well, maybe it's a bad idea in practice. No, you could say you can use Rav Soloveitchik's opinion to claim that vegetarianism should be an actualized way of life. Does that mean that Rabbi Soloveitchik himself was a vegetarian? As far as I know, no, but he wasn't concerned in the way that Rav Kook was. Okay, I know we don't have that much time. Must we eat meat on Shabbat and Yom Tov? The reason that people are often have heard that it says in various sources that there's an obligation to eat meat on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So it turns out that this is not true. It does say in the sources to eat meat on Shabbat and Yom Tov, but as is formulated here very clearly in the Mishnah Berurah talking about Shabbat, the rule is for oneg Shabbat is you should eat machalim umashkim hachashuvim lahem oneg. You should eat the foods that you enjoy. Since and the Chavetz Chaim in the Mishnah Berurah goes on to say, since the minastam, the assumption has been that most people enjoy eating meat, drinking wine. So that's why sources speak about having these foods on Shabbat. But the main thing is that you should eat the foods that you like and avoid the foods that you don't like. And he even mentions in passing there's an inyan of having fish at the meals on Shabbat, and there are even opinions that he quotes here saying that you should eat fish all 3 meals on Shabbat. But that's unless you don't like eating fish. If you don't like eating it, then don't eat it. Meaning it's not like most halachot. Most halachot are objective. The halacha that applies to me is the same halacha that applies to you. If we're in the same time and place, in the same community, etc. This halacha of oneg Shabbat is formulated in a subjective way. And the way that Rav Moshe Halevi Steinberg explains it in his book Chukat Hager, which is about conversion to traditional Judaism, a relatively early source, meaning compared to today, because 1971. He asks, is somebody allowed to convert to Judaism if they insist on being a vegetarian? After all, what about Shabbat and Yom Tov? And he goes through the sources, and he points out, in addition to what we just said, that the Shulchan Aruch itself gives an exception to the rule that you have to eat 3 meals on Shabbat. This is here in source number B. It's as quoted by Rabbi Steinberg. It is forbidden to fast on Shabbat, but and it's forbidden to cry on Shabbat because you're supposed to enjoy Shabbat. But if fasting and or crying, those are what you find enjoyable, then it's okay. Meaning even something that is intrinsically against, like the opposite of enjoyment of Shabbat for most people, an individual who really enjoys, they're crying to feel better afterwards. That's Rabbi Akiva. Or they're fasting on Shabbat because they fast or partially fast every day. So it would be hard for them to stop fasting on Shabbat. That's Rabbi Yehuda Chassid quoted here in the Shulchan Aruch. Point is, that just brings out, it emphasizes what we said before, which is should you eat meat on Shabbat? Yes, if you eat meat in general and you like eating meat. If you like eating meat, well, then make that a special thing that you eat on Shabbat. Great. But if you, for whatever reason, don't want to eat meat, then if you don't enjoy it for whatever reason, whether your taste buds or your digestive system or your sense of morality or whatever, well, then don't. This is not even controversial. What is controversial is the obligation of eating meat on Yom Tov. Those of you who were in the myth-busting class may recall that we spoke about this at greater length in myth-busting session number 4. I'm just going to summarize here. There were more sources there. The question is the Rambam, and what does the Rambam mean? Because the Rambam seems to say there's an actual obligation of eating meat on Yom Tov. Okay, we're going to set that aside for now because this is just a separate point. But how about the bottom line? Bottom line is, unless you're Yemenite, you don't follow the Rambam for halachic bottom line. The default is that the Shulchan Aruch is the bottom line. The Shulchan Aruch is interpreted by the commentaries, and the Shulchan Aruch says pretty clearly in source number 2 that the obligation on Yom Tov is to be in a good mood. You should be in a good mood, and the way it's formulated in the Gemara is, how do men get in a good mood? They eat meat. And at the time of the Beit HaMikdash, at the time of the Beit HaMikdash, it was to eat meat. And nowadays, for men anyway, it's to drink wine. And for women, it's to have nice clothes. And for kids, it's to have candy. But this is not an absolute thing. These are just examples. In other words, the people at the time of the Gemara, men, women, and children were assumed to like these specific things. But as formulated in some of the Achronim, commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, for example, Rav Shneir Zalman of Liadi, known as the Baal Tanya, in his halachic work, which people call Shulchan Aruch Harav, he points out, so he suggests that even though Rav Karo rejects the Rambam, who says there's an obligation of eating meat on Yom Tov, possibly only for men. Nevertheless, Shulchan Aruch Harav thinks that while meat is not an obligation, it is a mitzvah if it's something that you enjoy. Meaning, it fits into Simchat Yom Tov can be compared to Oneg Shabbat. In both of them, you should eat the foods that you enjoy, as formulated, and with this we'll wrap it up, as formulated by the Shagat Aryeh, major Achron, commenting on Gemara and Torah Shabbat Peh in general. He says that the mitzvah of Simcha Yom Tov is a Simcha Klalit. It's not. It's a general obligation of. It's an obligation on to be happy in general, as opposed to a specific thing. There aren't specific things that you need to eat or wear on Yom Tov. It's that b'chol minei simcha she'yocholet biyada lismoch. However, you can make yourself happy, you know, parenthetically, according within the confines of halacha. There are a lot of things you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. But within that which is allowed, if there's something that you would like to do that you are technically allowed to do on Yom Tov that will make you happy, then you should do that. V'lo dami l'shar mitzvot sheshavin b'chol adam. This mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov is different from other mitzvot which are the same for everybody or almost everybody. This mitzvah is personalized. This mitzvah is subjective. And then he says, and as for what it says in the Gemara about during the time that there was a Beit HaMikdash, that there was a mitzvah of Shalmei Simcha, which some want to tie into the obligation of Simcha and Yom Tov. He says, no, when there was a Beit HaMikdash, then there was also an obligation to bring Karban Shlamim, Shalmei Simcha. But that, even at the time of the Beit HaMikdash, that was not the mitzvah of Simcha and Yom Tov. The mitzvah of Simcha and Yom Tov then and now was you should do that which is allowed on Yom Tov and that which will make you happy, whether it involves eating something, drinking something, wearing something, presumably playing something, whatever activity that makes you happy. That's the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov. So going back to what we said before about Shabbat, the fact that classic sources speak about meat, they're starting with the assumption that that's what makes you happy. That's what you enjoy. And for many people, that is still true. And therefore, for many people, eating meat on Shabbat and on Yom Tov is a fulfillment of these mitzvot of Oneg Shabbat and Simchat Yom Tov. But if for whatever reason you don't enjoy eating meat, then you're not fulfilling a mitzvah to eat it, because the mitzvah is about eating what you like. If anything, the people who say, "Oh, the mitzvah is to eat meat," they've missed the point, because maybe they love eating meat, but there might be something else that they enjoy eating, and they think that there isn't a mitzvah to eat that on Yom Tov. No, the mitzvah is whatever it is that you personally enjoy, and that is allowed on Yom Tov. You should do that on Yom Tov. It's not about the meat. It's not about the wine. It's about the pleasure that is permitted. So that hope that I've clarified that somewhat. The short answer of must we eat meat on Shabbat and Yom Tov, the answer is yes, if that's what you love to eat. If it's not what you love to eat, then no, eat on Shabbat and Yom Tov what you do love to eat. Okay, we are done with the halacha topic, and now I'd like to briefly look at some recipes and dessert ideas for Parsha Korach. For those of you who were not here last week I presented Parshat recipes on Parsha Ba'alotcha and on Parshat Shlach, because here in Eretz Yisrael we are 1 week ahead of Chutz La'aretz in the Parsha. I uploaded to the website today the document called Recipes for Parshat Shlach. For those of you in Chutz La'aretz, if you didn't see it last week, then you can get it this week. But for right now, we're just going to do, from now on, for the next few weeks, we'll be doing the recipes just for the Israel Parsha. There's a baker, Orthodox Jewish baker in Johannesburg named Orit Tabak. I don't know how it's pronounced. And she presents in her Parsha dessert blog earthquake cookies, because Korach, earthquake, Korach is swallowed by the earth. She makes the cookies called zebra cookies, or others call crinkle cookies. Here's a picture of the ones that she made. In other words, we imagine the earth cracking open and Korach and the other bad people falling in. That's one possibility. Another one from Tammy Raps, the teacher in Teaneck, calls herself Parsha Mom because of all the Parsha-related foods that she's posted about. Since Korach is about divisiveness, so she mentions the crinkle cookies, but she also mentions making a tomato salad, because you could argue about it should be pronounced tomato or tomato, and possibly hot and spicy foods as well, for the to represent divisiveness. I don't know if that might be a bit too abstract. I mentioned last week that some people, when they're looking for Parsha related desserts, they're looking for something they can make with their kids. a kind of craft. So that's presented here in the blog called Challah Crumbs, edited by Devorah Levine Katz. On the later part of the story, where God tells each tribe to bring a rod, a staff, and only Aaron's rod, representing Levi, put forth buds and almonds. It's sprouted almonds. So you take, here's a picture. You take the pretzel rods and you melt chocolate and you dip the pretzel rods in that, and then you decorate them with different types of sprinkles to represent the flowers. Very, very clever and relatively straightforward. The Alicia Gechter in her Parsha food blog, she pointed out that the image of the staff that we just described always reminds her of the scene in the Disney movie Pinocchio, where Pinocchio's nose grows so long from lying it starts to sprout leaves and flowers. Though she doesn't actually have something that's directly about that, but she recommends something made with almonds. Okay, it's not so visual, but the Aaron's staff sprouted almonds, so chocolate almond biscotti, and spiced almonds, and what she mentions, actually, skip this. This was at the end of the her introduction. Um, she wanted to look up a sunken cake to reenact the earth swallowing Korach. This is a bit more abstract than the crinkle cookies. The problem is, if you're looking online, most people are trying to avoid sunken cakes. But she found a recipe for a lovely cherry sunken cake, and it looks concave. I see that Joan writes, pretty much every cake I bake is a sunken cake. So here you go. So here's, I don't know if it's so clear, but apparently from this picture, the middle of this cake is lower than the rest of it. So it's called a sunken cake. I don't know about you. If I were baking stuff, which I'm not, but if I were baking stuff, I would probably go with the earthquake cookies. Okay. Our time is up. Would anybody like to bring up any issues in the chat, or unmute yourself and ask a question?
I
I see.
have a question, Rabbi.
Go
Usually
ahead.
the life, the blood is really the life of the person. And perhaps, because that's the life that's according to the Torah. So it could be that's one of the reasons why we just don't eat the blood. And that's why there's such, I don't know if you mentioned that.
We mentioned in passing uh, that would seem to be like the next psukim after the ones about slaughtering the animal and eating it. It's very, very important to not eat the blood of the animal. So yes, Adam hu hanefesh. There's a lot you could say about that. Um, yes, so that that's why I've heard people argue that that's why kosher meat can't ever taste as good as the non-kosher meat, because our meat doesn't have the blood in it, quote unquote. I heard that from somebody quoting his father, who was where the son was keeping kosher and the father was not. I don't know if it's true, but it would not surprise me if it's true.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I see that Mark wrote, just last week, the New York State of Appeal ruled that an elephant in the Bronx Zoo is not a person legally and cannot benefit from certain human legal rights. Right. That was Happy the elephant, but the ruling was not a slam dunk, 5-2. So, yeah, how do you feel about elephants, peoplehood, and halacha? So that's something that I would like to think that rabbis and people learning Torah across the spectrum should be able to agree on, that just based on the source that we saw in source number 2, from the way that Hashem formulates it to Noah, you're allowed to eat animals because people are created in the image of God. Implication: animals are not. It's not clear to me how obvious the line between people and animals would be or should be for those people who don't start where we do. We start from the Torah, we start from ethical monotheism, where God, we have a tradition that people are creating an image of God and animals are not. That's a very clear distinction. But if you don't start from that perspective, it could be that it's not so obvious. I understand that that's very much on the margins of society today, but I'm saying we can. I'm not defending that approach because, like I said, it's pretty much open and shut from a Torah perspective. But if you, for those people, let's say people who are making rules for a society that is not Torah based, um, why is it so obvious that people have rights that animals do not? My impression is that pretty much everybody can agree that humans have rights that animals should not, but it's not so obvious why. Um, that's uh, that's what I have to say about that. I would be interested to read a a presentation from an atheist or somebody who is rejecting, you know, the Torah, starting from a different perspective, and yet they'll come to the same conclusion. But it's not clear to me how that would happen. See that Hannah brought up, where does chicken come in with regard to modern definitions of meat in Judaism? So that's one of those things that, as a result of the rabbis, the definition changed, right? On the Torah level, birds are not meat. They, just like fish, are not meat. And yet, uh, the majority opinion at the time of the Gemara was to treat birds as meat, and then with all sorts of ramifications for kashrut. But it, even though we do consider um, chicken and other birds, kosher birds, to be meat, bottom line is there will always be distinctions between that which in halacha, between that which the Torah considers meat and that which the rabbis consider to be meat. It could still be bottom line. You're not allowed to eat a chicken and cheese sandwich, but the question is, what happens when there are conflicts and one is choosing between, let's say, Torah violations and rabbinic violations? This is the sort of thing that I tend not to get into, but there are rabbis who specialize in this kind of issue. If somebody eats at Burger at McDonald's, how many prohibitions have they violated? Do we still apply the prohibition of eating basar v'chalav if the meat was not shechted? That sort of thing. Like I said, it's not really my thing, but there are people who love that sort of that type of question, that type of discussion. I see that Joan wrote, my son suggests we also make ice for Shabbat because korach is the same letters as kerach, which is ice in Hebrew. That would be one of those word plays that Israelis are going to come up with, and people whose first language is something other than Hebrew are not as likely to come up with. Um, like the same way that for the symbolic foods of on Rosh Hashanah, the same way that there were generations of Yiddish-speaking Jews who came up with foods where the wordplay is in Yiddish. Like carrots, because carrots in Yiddish is meron, and meron means more. So too, you have Israelis who come up with making the food symbolic, the foods that you're eating anyway, like basar, meat, for example, and they say we should uh, nishma rak bisarot tavot, that we should only hear good news, because basar and bisarot are also the same letters. And what's the other one? Oh, marak. Um, Yimarku avonenu, maraka soup. So our sins should be wiped out. So yes, this is the wordplay tends to be different based on the language, the first language that people speak. So Mark points out that the carrot also works as wordplay in Hebrew, because gezer. Carrot is like gazar. You should only have good gzerot, or that a bad gzerot should be wiped out. And people even try to make it work in English as well. They say we should not care at all about problems this year. We shouldn't have problems to care about. No, to care at all about. It's a bit weak, but people like to do these things, and there's a great tradition of doing that on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, thanks for joining me. And next week we'll go back to a more even balance of two topics. One is a hashkafa topic about the significance of eating and the place of eating in Jewish thought, as as compared with a halachic issue, which is a different one. Oh yes, and Mark concludes with the lettuce, half a raisin, and celery. As the special food, symbolic food in Rosh Hashanah to represent, let us have a raisin celery. Okay. Well,
Thank you. Have a Shabbat Shalom. Be well.
thank you. You too.
Enjoyed your class. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks to everybody for joining me. And